welcome to the Radiant Astrology Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Caudill, and in today's podcast and video, which we're filming for my Radiant Astrology YouTube channel, which I don't usually post to, but I thought, how fun would it be to do a video on top of our podcast this time. We have a lot to cover, and we're actually just going to be covering one of the most significant aspects of this year, which is the Saturn-Uranus square. And one of the reasons we wanted to highlight this one is because it is going to be triggered by Mars, and not only Mars, but Venus as well. Plus, there's a lot of other things happening for this first half of July 2021. And I thought, who better to discuss all things cosmic, but my very dear friend from the Energetic Principles podcast, Melissa LaFara. Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hello, Christina. It's so glad to be here with you again on the podcast. Not my first rodeo, which is exciting, but I'm so jazzed to talk about such an electric, bold aspect that I think all of us are already feeling. And so I'm excited to dive into it and get in there.
Yes, I know, because we've been talking about this being the signature transit Saturn-Uranus square of 2021. And for those of you who are still learning astrology, you know, there's some aspects with planets that are outer planets like Uranus, and Saturn is kind of the gatekeeper between the inner and outer planets, but they're both relatively slower moving planets. But then when you have a trigger planet like Mars coming in the mix, as Mars will be doing very soon here in Leo, creating a T-square, then we'll really see, you know, a very highlighted version of the Saturn-Uranus square that's sort of in effect all year. It's sort of creating the landscape. And then we have Mars just sort of igniting a fire under everyone's tush that has to do with this massive Saturn-Uranus square aspect. So let's start out with the Saturn-Uranus square. So Melissa, do you want to kind of give us your sort of overview of what you've seen this year with that aspect happening in the skies?
Oh gosh, what haven't we seen with that aspect? We've seen a lot of movement, but also slow movement, frustration, a lot of things that were very fixed being uprooted in a way towards permanent change. Because that's the thing, is that Saturn is in Aquarius, Uranus is in Taurus. These are fixed air and fixed earth signs, and fixed signs in general do not move. You know, they are fixed in their nature. They are strong. They stay where they are. And so when you have this, especially Uranus and Taurus, which we've felt for a while now, which is a very electrifying and also unstable component that likes to shake things loose. And Saturn, you know, is this structural element that is in an Aquarius. This is future minded. This is prospects going forward. This is what is good, maybe rule wise or ideologically wise for the greater public and society. And so we're just feeling this crunch and this jam up of deep changes that take a really long time and that are uprooting things that were already very deep to begin with.
Mm-hmm. And Aquarius being the sign of the collective, we really notice that this is a time, especially in America, but all over the world really, that societies are going through these massive change, like greater than we have seen in decades. And with Saturn being in the sign of Aquarius, one of the things is, you know, if Aquarius is, again, the collective, and with the square with Uranus, you know, things that are like ready to go forward now, like we're ready to make big changes, but then there's always going to be that resistance, you know, from the status quo, or from those who have benefited from, say,
Yeah.
patriarchal type of, white supremacy or whatever have you, that is going to be resisting these fast changes. And, sometimes maybe that is the universe's way of saying that, okay, like we want to move really fast, but then there's also, these sort of stop gaps. But it feels like the direction we are going is progress. The direction we're going is forward. The direction we're going is change. And it might not be one side, if you could think of it as two sides or two ends of a spectrum. It might not be one side fully gets what they want. It's there's something with the square aspect, that something has to be birthed, maybe in a whole new concept that's not in anybody's mind yet. But essentially, things are breaking apart. There's breakthrough possible. I think that's a lot of the overall picture that we're seeing.
Yeah. And I always like how Bernadette Brady frames squares just in general, with the idea that squares are really nobody's fault. They're just turning points, and we have to choose kind of like one way or the other, or like maybe we're backed into a corner if you think about a square being a 90-degree angle. And that's why it can be so frustrating, because really what is underway is you can't put blame on anybody for it. It just is what it is, and you have to just work through that. And I totally agree with you about uh really the element of having to find a balance, a very tense balance with both of these energies. We can't just, like make quick changes and break away from it all and say, we have to have the Saturnian piece to it. That's like, well, what are these changes look like for the long run? Do they actually, what's that old term, you cut off your nose to spite your face, because you could get all excited and like make this decision, and then there's consequence, and that's Saturn that comes from it too. So there's really this cause and effect within all the change that is happening, and slowly but surely moving through that, because even though fixed signs are very rooted, they just move much slower. So that's where that frustration also comes in too. And then add Mars and Venus in here, and then especially Mars, and we get this T square jam up, basically, that's activating, but also puts a stick in our spoke, is that in the wheel, to some extent.
Yes. And so if we were to, let me see if I can real quick, just to give a visual for those who are watching on YouTube. Can you see this, Melissa? Can you see
I
the?
can.
Okay. So this is right now where we are at. And it's cast for, well, it's Atlanta, but it's whole signs. But essentially, we can see that we've got the Saturn-Uranus square, Saturn at 12, and it's retrograde right now in Aquarius, squaring Uranus at 13, Taurus. And then up here, we have Mars and Leo coming up to oppose Saturn, and then shortly after will square Uranus. So the Saturn opposition is, what did we say,
July
July
1st.
1st, and then the square to Uranus would be a couple days,
The 3rd.
the 3rd. And so and then July 4th, right?
I know, July 4th.
Independence Day.
Woo!
Think about Independence Day, what that means. Breaking away, from, that's what happened. It was like our forefathers in America. They broke away from, the English society and the Queen and the crown and all that stuff. Which I think there's more we can say about that too.
Yes.
But, just from an energy standpoint, and we were talking about earlier that in January or February, the early part of the year, when the Saturn Uranus alignment square first came into alignment. And that was during, it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And there was this huge, like, ice storm, like glacial wind or something, that came through most of America. And there were places like in Texas that we normally think of as one of the hotter places in the United States. It was like a frozen tundra. And so that coldness that we experience, cold and dry, that is said is the Aquarius archetype, that was like really heightened at that time. And now we're already hearing with this Mars and Leo, and as we know, Mars is the planet of action, of drive, of passion, of instinct, and it triggers, not only in the human experience, but it's just a trigger energy. In Leo is over the top. Usually it's a fire sign and it goes over the top, and we're already hearing that there is, like today in Seattle, the temperatures are going up to like 117 degrees, and that is like a record, breaking a record. So we have these extreme heat waves. And so we see, like, like you'd said earlier, is extreme weather patterns are being triggered right now too. So we can see that this is something that is showing up in our world in many ways, but especially in these extremes that we see of in the fixed signs often.
Yes, fixed signs can definitely give us those extremes, and Uranus involved definitely likes to shock us in some way. And another point to bring up to that with the extreme weather that is happening within this configuration is the consequences that come by it. Because another thing that's very big in the news right now that happened right before the Capricorn full moon on the 24th here of June is that massive building collapse that happened in Miami, which is incredibly unfortunate. But what it does bring to mind is back to infrastructure, and buildings. Uranus and Taurus, these buildings that are supposed to stand the test of time, and really there are cracks in the foundation. This is and especially with Mars about to trigger that area. Mars in the tarot is the tower, and when something falls. And that was another thing that happened. So basically what's happening with that building collapse is that there's a lot of talk now about new regulations about buildings 40 years and over being inspected on a more regular basis, trying to catch this. And that's a big thing in America, is just infrastructure in general and it falling apart. And that ties back into what you were just talking about with the extreme cold freeze that we had at the first pass of Saturn Uranus square, February 17th. And it was exact to the day when that was happening. And so what happened then was now Texas was basically like, we don't have the infrastructure to deal with these extremes that are coming through. And they had power grid problems because they had made questionable decisions about how to use their power, where it's going, who controls it, all these things. So I think that's another big part of the Saturn Uranus square is just infrastructure for the long term and how we're going about that.
And you had noted before we got on the call that that collapse of the building in Miami, the condo building, actually also happened shortly after the Capricorn full moon. And a few things, Capricorn being, again, another sign ruled by Saturn. We often think of Capricorn and Saturn having to deal with structures and buildings even specifically, and also the karmic repercussions. It's like if you don't have a strong foundation at some point, the karma of that is it will show itself. It's like I also saw a lot during that Capricorn full moon, because the Mars Saturn was coming into alignment. Mars Saturn opposition is starting to come into alignment, a lot having to do with these breaking through or resisting any kind of sort of Saturnian element. And even just that Mars Saturn, the Saturn being that which wants to have, structure and be sustaining or whatever. And the Mars, however that showed up, we don't know yet the reason why this building collapsed, but, it triggered that sort of almost like an attack on that Saturnian element.
Yeah. Well, the Saturnian element was probably to go back to what you're kind of saying, like maybe that karmic element is that there were reports from when a building inspector came out for that building in 2018 talking about the cracks that were in the pool area and the parking structure. And really what happened is they just sat on there that information for too long, because there is a thing with Saturn too, like, like you can wait too long to take action with something. And they had just secured, I think, like $12 million in funding to start. And they had people up on the roof starting with that, but they hadn't started with the parking yet. And of course, there's still going to be a lot of time before they're able to fully understand exactly what happened. It might not be that, but there are these reports that were pushed off for a long time. And once again, we're back to cause and effect. You know, if you don't take care of something that needs attention, or take responsibility for something that needs attention, you know, that and Mars comes around, you know, there's a chance that that is activated in a way that is can be very destructive, and
Yeah.
unfortunate.
And the other thing about that Capricorn full moon, also Neptune stationed retrograde right at the same time that building collapsed. That's very much, Neptune sort of dissolves things.
Yeah.
And but with the Capricorn full moon, I was thinking that there was a lot of like sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, or like, enough is enough kind of thing, like something coming to, because usually we think of full moons as something either coming to fruition, or it could be like something finally just, especially with the Neptune station, maybe something is like can no longer sustain, the center can no longer hold, as they say. Because another thing that was happening at about that same time was Britney Spears coming out and telling her story. And I noticed that she'd said about her conservatorship, which is very much a Saturnian thing, the control, controlling
Yeah.
her, and her being this courageous Mars and Leo kind of like element, saying like, no, enough is enough. She was using phrases like enough is enough. It had been 13 years, right? Like a little over a Jupiter cycle, and or almost, two Saturn cycles too. It'd been 13 years, and she had said enough is enough, like, kind of like I can't do this anymore, like, or I won't do this anymore. And that seemed to be, and interestingly, I see that sort of echoing in a lot of sort of similar experiences from that time, because with, Saturn and Capricorn wants us to sustain, sometimes we are pushed too far. Sometimes we can't anymore, right? And something has to give. It's like something's got to give, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah, and that can definitely come up with Mars and Saturn when they meet, because there is a sense of pushing through something, or having determination or endurance. And really it was like the moment everybody was waiting for, at least her fans, because they're like, you need to step up. This is very Mars and Leo, right? This is up to you to do this. And at the time of her doing this, Saturn was exactly on her moon in Aquarius.
Wow.
And so, which is big because, for some of you astro nerds out there, if you know anything about perfections and highlighted planets of the year, she's actually in a Saturn year. And so Saturn's very important in her chart right now, and especially being on her moon in the fifth house of children, of pleasure, of joy. She's saying enough is enough, because I can't live my life. I can't live it to the fullest. She said that she wanted to take a birth control device out of her body because she wanted to have a baby. These are very fifth house elements, and this Saturnian energy that's activated by the Uranus going. She's like inside, like something has to change, because she's a Libra rising. And so Uranus for her is in the eighth house of like transition and like birth, death, things need to change for her. And so here she is stepping up with that Mars element. And I'm hoping for her sake, because it really does sound like a raw deal, that something finally moves in her case.
Yeah, and Saturn being retrograde right now, it seems like Saturn is not able to, like maybe Saturn's in a
Mm,
little bit of a more, I don't want to fully say weak position, but not fully able to overcome all of the, Leo, Mars and Leo attacks potentially.
yeah.
And so it does, maybe there's something in her that grew to, a certain amount of strength that said, you know what? Let me just take control of my own, life and responsibility. Because actually, a lot of times Saturn shows us where we need to take responsibility. And even, Saturn retrograde periods, of course, we have them every year. for what about like 5 months,
4 or 5 months. Yeah,
4 or 5 months a
there.
year. And, there's something there about Saturn being like the parental figure, or, the authority
Yeah.
figure. And it's almost like kind of like they've gone on a break, or they're not like fully there. So it's like, we have to figure things out on our own, or, we can experiment more. And I feel like that now is a time where maybe we can take on like ownership of our Saturn, rather than expecting or depending on it even from the outside so much.
Yeah. And another thing that's fascinating about her situation that she's in right now, which I've seen a lot of fellow astrologers start to talk about, because what's going on with as Mars and Venus both square Uranus, like they're going to do the opposition with Saturn first, but then they move on a few days later to square Uranus. And in ancient astrology, there's a term called antitia or antesia. I've heard in both different forms. But what that is it's this mirroring point from the solstices, from the Cancer and Capricorn solstices, where these side by side, Gemini and Cancer are in Antitia, and actually Taurus and Leo are in Antitia. And what that is, it's like a mirror point, right? A mirror is a reflection, it's a shadow to some extent. And so when we have Antitia activated, which these planets, Mars and Venus both, are creating this kind of shadow element with Uranus, there is this like underlying, kind of like wild energy, and this, like, I don't want to call it darker energy, but there's something hidden there. It's being activated. And what I've seen a lot of people talking about is about Britney Spears being the ultimate wild woman and divine feminine that's trying to be suppressed. And we see this shadow side, and you're trying to ignore this side of just women in general, or and demonize it. And I know, Christina, I feel like you have so much to say on this, but I thought that was fascinating and so true with her story.
Yes. And when you say that, I also think who else comes to mind is the uh, the tennis star
Oh,
from
yes.
Roland Garros. The Japanese American
Oh,
Naomi Osaka,
okay. Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And how she had stood up at the French Open and said, this is a gal who beat Serena Williams. I mean, like, you gotta really be someone with extreme talent to be able to do that. And she's made millions in, with sponsorships and things like that, and winning tournaments. And so, like, I have a lot of respect for tennis players, because you're out there pretty much alone. You're not relying on a team or anything. It's you out there. And especially women tennis players, because they so much is dependent on their consistency, and there hasn't been that many women tennis players who have really risen to the top. For years we've had like Federer and Nadal and Djokovic, like dominating men's tennis, but the only people who've, women that I'm aware of that have really dominated women's tennis is the Williams sisters. And then unfortunately, Venus had gotten ill, but she's still in the game. But Serena pretty much has been dominating women's tennis for whatever decades. But Naomi Osaka, she was like not just a rising star, but she was really consistently, winning tournaments and things. And so when she came out, and this was it around the time of the Mercury retrograde that was starting to happen, I believe.
I feel like it was a big story maybe around the lunar
Oh
eclipse.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah,
Lunar eclipse in
about a month
Sagittarius.
ago.
Yes, and but this was very much a Saturn Uranus thing. Like, she was trying to change the whole concept of what is a norm and what should be a norm for professional tennis players, because you think that, okay, they're superhuman, they're professionals, they're making millions, they should just shut up and do their thing. But she was like, you know what, for my mental health, like, why shouldn't her mental health also be a priority, right? I mean, she's asked so much. I mean, basically to push her body beyond the limit. I feel like if she says there's something that could be changed to protect players' mental health, they should listen. And in fact, what happened when she said I wasn't going to, or she said she wouldn't talk to the press prior to her tournament because it throws her off and they're doubting her, and you have to be mentally tough to do
Mm.
that game, because it's all about your mental toughness, because everybody by that point is fit and strong and fast or whatever, but you got to also be mentally tough. And she said that it throws her off, it's not good for her mental health. And what was surprising to me was not only did the French Open, because that was the tournament that she was having this issue at, not only did the French Open refuse to, let her skip the press briefing, but all the other Grand Slam tournaments. So there's four in the world, Australia, United States, Wimbledon in the UK, and the French Open in France. They all signed a collective, here's another collective letter to say, like, she wouldn't be allowed to do that, like, at any tournament, at any of the Grand Slams, which is crazy. I mean, one young woman, a star, and she faced this huge backlash from the professional tennis world. But it took so much guts for her to do that, and then for her to withdraw, which I think a lot of people, that was very, you're right, that was actually the solar eclipse, close to the solar
It
eclipse
was
when
like
she
right in
withdrew.
between.
Yeah, because the withdrawing is the lights out part of that we
Yeah.
often see with a solar eclipse when the sun is eclipsed, right? So yeah, it was, the whole thing was, the emotional sort of expression of the Sagittarius lunar eclipse, and then sort of the lights out of the Gemini solar eclipse. And that was actually really a sad. I read everywhere they were saying it's a sad day for tennis, because nobody wants to see. It's so rare to have that experience of being, like, a top up and coming winner in tennis and in professional tennis. And so for her to withdraw herself, that was really sad. But that really, to her, made a difference. So this is really a time of activism. I mean, we've seen it in almost every field, but the activism is something that, very much is a signature of the Saturn Uranus, since, like, who wins, who loses. And sometimes it's not even about, maybe you lose in, by standing up and by speaking out, but do you actually make a dent in the system? And maybe that, making that dent helps it easier for somebody coming after you, or changes the tone of what's a norm, which is very much, again, a Saturn thing in
Mm-hmm.
in the world or in the field that you're trying to affect.
Yeah, yeah, these are all themes. And as you were talking about her, Christine, I had to like pull up her chart just because I'm like, what does she have that's in the way of this Saturn Uranus
Oh my
square?
God, what did you find?
And so she's born October 16th, 1997. I don't know if there's a time. I just went for the date. But she has Jupiter at 12 degrees of Aquarius. So she basically has Jupiter, Saturn is on her Jupiter in a mental sign, this mental toughness, right? And she has Pluto, Venus, and Mars in Sagittarius, which is the Jupiter ruled sign. And that lunar eclipse that kind of started the whole thing for her was on her Pluto. And so that she has quite the story developing there,
Wow,
but
the
it's,
lunar eclipse is on her Pluto. Oh my goodness. I
yeah.
mean, come
So
on. There's no getting
yeah.
away from a lunar eclipse on your Pluto.
No, there isn't, and especially when it's backed by Jupiter, who had Saturn on it right there. But I love what you're saying though about being willing to take a stand, especially with her Jupiter in Aquarius. Yeah, it's up against the rules and the regulations of Saturn and what's imposed there. But in order for progress, which is Jupiter's whole agenda to begin with, sometimes you have to get some space from something, cut something off. I mean, that's very Aquarius, because a lot of times we think just Jupiter just opens up doors, and sometimes doors are open because doors shut. And she feels like a good example, even though it's a sad one of what that might look like. But she's just another figure that is very integral in the, the characteristic of Saturn Uranus that we're looking
Yeah,
at.
and that Pluto experience is something that can really transform us or reshape who we are. So, you know, I doubt she's going away,
Yeah.
anytime soon, but maybe how she shows up is, completely different now. Like she will always be shaped by this experience likely or for a long time to come. People will remember for, for better or for worse. I mean, she had a lot of support, but then there was also a lot of, a lot of players and things that were against it and said like, yeah, and then of course in the media like, oh, she's so spoiled and she should just do her job, but the good for her for standing her ground and really bringing to light. And actually all of Saturn in Aquarius has really increased the focus on mental health in as a
Mhm.
discussion in the collective. I mean, it's something that we haven't really prioritized in this country, especially because mental health help is really expensive. Number one, and especially in America. I mean, I think in some other countries they have more like um, more public support. But in America, it's expensive, and also, because people have rights, you can't make them get help if they don't want to, and sometimes maybe they don't know they need it as much or something like that.
Mhm.
And so I have to credit Akuta Bava because he was on my podcast um, uh, before, let me see, was it early 2020, before when we just were starting to get into lockdown and stuff like that. And we're talking about Saturn and Aquarius, and he said this is going to really bring a focus on mental health, and people are going to be suffering more from mental health issues because um, Aquarius being associated with the mental realm, and Saturn, putting a lot of pressure on that. I mean, we all got a lot of mental pressure when we felt like rats trapped in a cage, right? During our lockdown, however long it was. And but getting back to this Mars and Venus coming into alignment in Leo, creating this T square with Saturn and Uranus. Um, I feel like that this summer was a time where I had always been looking forward to, because I'm like, okay, so people with Saturn going retrograde and Jupiter in Pisces, people are going to really feel almost like freedom again. Like we're going to party, we're going to have fun, and then and then Mars and Venus in Leo, wanting to party, wanting to have fun, wanting to have enjoy themselves and over the top. However, Saturn in Aquarius does not play and doesn't always play nicely. And you were saying before we started recording is that because of this new Delta variant, there's recommendations that we need to wear masks again. We need to start being careful again, and we might need to think about, you know, more of the preventing the pandemic spread thing, because this thing can really spread really fast and be really devastating. And it reminds me of like, it's like people get just a taste of freedom, and if that gets curtailed at all, then the backlash could be really extreme, don't you think?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because, when we're dealing with fire signs are just individualistic to begin with. They're passionate. They want what they want, especially Aries and Leo. I mean, Sag too. Who am I kidding? Uh, and so there is that. And well, and that's the interesting thing about Jupiter having moved into Pisces and opening that floodgates. Cause it was like the day that Jupiter moved into Pisces, I swear the streets were like Disneyland. Like people were out and about, and it was like a whole new world. And, because what happens is Jupiter, once again, it opens the door. It was in its own sign. There's no boundaries when we're looking at Jupiter, especially in Pisces. But it also left Saturn to do a lot of damage on its own in Aquarius because it didn't have that benefic Jupiter to kind of soften what was happening in Aquarius, which is actually what might be nice about when Jupiter moves back into Aquarius, but where that freedom we might have got might be curtailed in a way. And so once again, back to looking at a square aspect, and especially a T square aspect, which Mars and Venus are making. Mars puts some sort of, can have us be very like aggressive or angry about something, or like, with Saturn put some obstacle in our way. Venus, she's a social planet. and being able to connect with each other. And so, it just this morning, last couple of days, but this morning in particular, saw an article, and the CDC recommends masks again for all people, whether you're vaccinated or not, because it's not, this new variant is kind of something else, and we're still trying to get a grasp on that. And really, science can only move so fast when what's evolving is moving faster. And so we have to have time and space with this. And to go back to what you were saying, which I think was really potent, Christina, about the mental health issue, is that this is part of it, because that actually, I saw a lot of people getting triggered when we were opening up, because it was almost like it was too much and overwhelming for people to just get back out there in this world that's changed so much, and not having dealt with these underlying issues and mental stress, but also just pain around and emotional stuff that was still coming up, and not addressing that and trying to sweep those things under the rug. So, to play to your point, I think that is a huge, huge part of Saturn and Aquarius, especially within, the Uranus component, but probably later in the year when we have all the Scorpio energy that's going to trigger that placement too, in November. So just saying, I think there is a lot to that piece. But yeah, right now Mars is stirring the pot and those masks are back on.
And yeah, I love what you said about that, because this is the thing. We see so much fear mongering, or maybe like bad talk around planets going retrograde, but it's kind of brilliant and wise that we go forward, and then we kind of need to go back a little bit in order to go forward again. Because, for instance, right, when Saturn entered Aquarius in 2020, we had social distancing for the first time, the masks, and then it got to the extreme, quarantines and lockdowns. And then when Saturn went retrograde last year, then there was a little loosening of that, and people were able to kind of get back out there. But anyone who's smart realized like this isn't going to last too much, because then when Saturn went direct again, then we were fully back into quarantine times. And now we have this other sort of test. And like you said, so then when Jupiter went into Pisces, what was it, a month or so ago? Was it in May, I
May
think?
13th or 14th, one of the two.
In May, then astrologers knew this was just temporary,
Yes.
because Jupiter had been under Saturn's, in Saturn's kind of cage there in Aquarius. And it's like, yes, let me go make out with strangers, like at, the restaurant or whatever. So that's what I actually read an article about that in New York, like that was happening all over New York. And but then, I've also heard things about people feeling very awkward about getting back out there. It's like, gosh, just because people invite me to a barbecue and I have all the social anxiety, like maybe I don't want to go. Maybe it's okay to say no. It's like, oh my God. Like, and for me, I gained so much weight in lockdown, whatever, out of a lot of it. I think maybe the cortisol, like a friend of mine, Margaret Gray, had said, like, it's probably all the cortisol too, like on top of that, like eating for comfort and things like that. And now I'm like, oh my God, I'm going out in the world in this different shaped body,
Yeah.
And then now we go back in, like when we will be, I really feel like in the fall, we'll begin, and part of the winter, we will have to go back to some of those quarantine times. Now, some people may be doing it kicking and screaming, but the Delta variant thing is nothing to play with. My friend Shireen Vismaya is living in India, and they're already seeing how it's like really ravaging things there. So hopefully we'll all learn how to be safe, whether we are vaccinated or not. We have to consider the collective. And see, this is the whole thing. It's funny. I saw somewhere on like Facebook or someplace, somebody said like, well, wearing a mask is a very personal decision. And rightly so, this person got like really, had a lot of detractors, because it's not about it being personal anymore. At some point, I mean, in America especially, we are so used to being the pioneering country. It's like you got to get yours, you got to, because there's no help, and but we're, you're strong enough, you can do it, and da, da, da. But at some point, we need to consider, like you said, with science, there's only so much we can know. This thing's moving faster than we can figure it out. We have to do things that concern the collective. And so we've never really, at least in this country, except for maybe I would say a lot of like the Pacific Northwest or like the West Coast, probably has more of this sort of almost a European mindset, or maybe even an Asian mindset, that like what you do affects the collective. You can't
Yeah.
just like throw your junk like on the beach and stuff and expect, whatever, someone will clean it up or the ocean will take it out. Like, no, you need to actually do something, go out of your way to be concerned with like everyone. And that's something that we're really learning. It's a long, a lesson long overdue in America, I believe. Having lived in Europe myself at some time, it's amazing how different it is. That, and now I will say Europeans have had a hard time too with like, lockdowns and quarantining and things like that, of course. But there tends to be like a different mindset that like, it's important that I do something for the collective, not just for my own personal will, which that's a very different mindset that we've had here in America. But can we actually come to see that it actually benefits us? I mean, like if I see someone on Facebook whose child died and they couldn't go to the funeral because, of these measures, or their grandparent or whoever, then, that I think should affect all of us, that we really need to know that what we do does have an impact on others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is Saturn and Aquarius speaking, because the limitations are coming from the collective, the collective just energy and what's happening, the storyline, like what's happening. It is not well, okay. So and I
Well,
really
oh,
feel
one more thing I want to say before if we move on to that, or to something else, is that if we don't, this is the thing with Saturn, is if you don't do your Saturn, then it will likely be imposed on you.
on
Like
you,
I
yeah,
would
in some
rather
way.
clean up my side of the street than get like a ticket, like, or something like that I have to. But if we look at like, there's certain countries like, the Philippines, their president there is saying like, if you don't get your vaccine, we're going to take you and like stick it in your butt. And supposedly in, I think, Russia also, they're starting to clamp down and um make it mandatory vaccine. So like I seriously, I think we're way too individualistic in this country to let that happen, but hopefully it won't get to that point. But that's another thing. It's like, okay, we have it, yes, it is voluntary now, but at what point would it be mandatory? We don't want to get to that point. That's where we can have consciousness and make decisions around that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I'm
Well, I
sorry, what
think
were you gonna
to
say?
know that I was going to play off the point of what you're talking about the individualistic nature and how that can actually be a little detrimental within the, like trying to find that balance of like still being the individual, having your own rights and feeling like you have autonomy over yourself within a situation that is very much caught up in the good, but also the limitations of being in a society with other people. And, like not your life isn't completely unto your own. And this is the interesting part about the Mars and Venus activations in Leo, and just all, and of course, what's going to happen is the, Mercury and the sun are going to follow suit eventually when we get there. Right now, we're just in Venus Mars territory. But what happens is that those planets oppose Saturn, but then they trine Chiron in Aries and then square Uranus in Taurus. And so Chiron, this is this pain, this wounding, this trigger point, and it's in a sign of individuality. And, like there could be consequences or painful repercussions around decisions that we make solely for ourselves. Because right now, Saturn and your Chiron are actually in a sextile, and they're trying to work together. How do we like still have our autonomy, still have that Aries energy, but also think of the collective, and have a symbiosis there. And so it's an interesting trajectory that these planets
Yeah.
do with that.
And there are some things that are really difficult, like say, for instance, music and concerts. I think we might have talked about this before, is that like we have really missed something by not having,
Mm.
music and the arts and everything. So I'm not saying it's like just shut up and go inside and don't, like I'm not saying that at all. I mean, this has been a very difficult, it's been painful to the soul sometimes to not be able to go and experience art. I mean, I'm a big fan of the arts, visual arts, performing arts, music, things like that. And then we realize how vital it is to us. And yes, we can watch things, online and things like that, but it's not the same. And a lot of times, artists, they need that gallery exhibition, they need that concert, they need that dance performance in order to create some work or create a body of work that they can then share in that way, that and be received. And so that's where I can see it could be kind of painful, say, if it's like, yay, we finally are able to do our concert or whatever, and then maybe it gets curtailed or something. That to me would be so painful. But another way of seeing Chiron too is it could be also that healing too that comes from like, wow, I finally went to that first concert, or that first play that I wasn't able to, that I've been putting off for what seems like years. Maybe it's been a
Yeah.
year. But I'm hoping for the best, that a fire trine with Chiron could help to bring out some of the more healing. Sometimes it means we have to share our pain in order to open up to the healing.
Yeah. Well, and maybe we have to get through the Saturn of putting your mask back on to get to the healing of still being able to go to the show. Because the thing is that we're not in complete restriction again. It's just we fully went almost no restriction. And then now that we're being asked for like kind of a minor restriction, there's like a pushback, like, no, but I had the full freedom. But it's like, no, you are going to be able to do these things you want to do, but there is this caveat of having to at least introduce this precaution in order to do so.
Yeah, and
And
and what I'm hearing is that like it makes sense, but it's like when things are seen as so black and white, like I either have total freedom or I'm totally, being stripped of all my freedoms.
back
Which
to the fixed,
is very,
right?
yeah, exactly. I was gonna say that's such a fixed thing. It's like it's either this or it's that.
Yeah. Well, and to play to your point about just talking about the need for that, because I actually drew a couple of oracle cards for Mars activating the hotspot and then Venus activating the hotspot. But the trajectory for Mars, I got anger, I got death, which is death is transition. It can be actual death, but it's usually just transition. But also confidence. And this is interesting, but back to with hunger. And so I want to like just talk about that a little bit because sometimes we get angry about things or irritated. And it's very important that we have that experience because it allows us to have a death or a transition that then gives us confidence to go in a different direction or to pursue something because we're fed up. But the underlying factor of it all was behind hunger. And what hunger means is that we're hungry for something more, something's missing. And especially in Leo, this personalized, this creativity, this fire, this self, love, and just feeling alive and vital. It's the sun sign. It makes me wonder if part of this activation isn't really just tapping us into and motivating us in albeit difficult ways at times to have a breakthrough is to be like what's missing here, and how do I need to be fired up and serious and willing to persist and endure what's necessary in order to bring more something that's more meaningful to me in my life in this current condition, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that's really beautiful because like I mean in one way we're just so, the higher side I think of the Mars and Venus and Leo is like just being, having so much wonder and gratitude for this bit of freedom that we do have. Um but we want to watch definitely when Jupiter goes back into Aquarius, and also when Saturn stations direct. That's all happening, like I think October or something time frame. I have to look at that. But that's really when I feel like, restrictions are going to, be even more pronounced.
Yeah. Well, we will have Jupiter moves back into Aquarius, I think on the 28th of July, and then it opposes Mars at 29 degrees of Leo and Aquarius the following day. So that is definitely a turning point. If anybody's looking for a turning point, that is one.
Yeah, Saturn
Definitely.
stations direct in, what was it, October, oh yeah, like October 11th, I believe, 10th, 11th. And so yeah, wow. So Jupiter just had a little taste of freedom there in Pisces. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was this beginning of July. The second and third are interesting for Mercury because we just had this long Mercury retrograde in Gemini. Mercury's still in Gemini but direct now. And July 2nd and 3rd are the dates where Mercury passes the degrees of its conjunction with the sun. And also, which normally we see that as something we want to look toward after, because that degree is activated. But also, that is the solar eclipse degree. So that was like Gemini 19 and 20. And so I would think that anything that was coming up from that Mercury retrograde. We have more information. There could be some kind of surprising information, some illuminating information, maybe even some challenging information, especially from that eclipse period. Because what was interesting about the eclipse period is it was also during a Mercury retrograde, and Mercury ruled the solar eclipse and the Mercury retrograde. So very, very important for Mercury.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, Christina. Because I mean, what better timing? I don't know. Better was the word I'm looking for, but to have Mercury meet because any planet that hits an eclipse point, especially a recent one, Mars in particular, but Mercury, because like you said, was the ruler or the lord of that eclipse. I think it's very significant that it's now reaching that point in its direct as it starts to pick up speed, as it's in its own sign too, the purity of what Mercury can, the information it can disseminate, and it being very, very fact-based, mercurial, like we learn something, some information comes out, and this could be around things like science or tech, and like just so we learn something. That's essentially Gemini. But whatever it is we learn, at the same time, we have Mars opposing Saturn that exact day on a last quarter moon in Aries. So the moon is feeling the tension and turning that page, that crisis of consciousness page, and is being deferred by Mars and Saturn. So there is another, like, there's something that turns on July 1st where that information is going to come out, and that wall might be up at that. There's something happens there.
Yeah, and that sort of defiance, I think, of likely with the Mars, um, like, don't tread on me over, the Saturn. And so definitely I would be looking at experiences of people like speaking out against something. I mean, we see that seems like practically every day these days, but things that really like hit the zeitgeist, or even in our own lives, if you have anything that is being hit by these degrees. Again, it's like 12, 13 of the fixed signs, and the mutable signs 19 to 20, or you can use wider orbs. But, if you had a maybe dramatic or things happen over the Mercury retrograde, that there might be another, some more information coming through, something more to learn. And maybe finally we make some decisions. It's so hard to usually really make any decisions with any finality during a Mercury retrograde because sometimes we don't have all the information, or sometimes we do make decisions we never would have made before. Now, will they be good decisions or bad decisions? Sometimes we don't know until after Mercury retrograde. I'm not going to say they're always bad decisions. Maybe there's things that we wouldn't have made before, but afterward is when we get a little bit more discernment.
Yeah, yeah. So, or what we were thinking about around the solar eclipse comes back, and then we're like, okay, well, now I see that maybe a little more clearer. There's the clarity is an interesting thing because Mercury is on its way to square Neptune for the last time, which was very
That's
much part
right. That's
of,
right.
so there's still an element of mystery at play, and Mercury and Gemini can be so sure of its position. And like you said, like people, information coming out and people speaking all about it. Like I think opinions are going to be all over the place. Everybody's going to have something to say about something. But what I think is very interesting about just the way this is all lined up, because of Saturn being retrograde and already having squared Uranus, is that this is the trajectory that these planets make. And we'll take Mars as our first, incidence, is that we hit Saturn in opposition, we hit the wall, we hit the thing we have to get through in the obstacle. Then we have that trine to Chiron we're talking about, where that either that pain comes up, which can be easily, pain to be healed in some way. And then we get the kind of like pressure and kind of the needing to free up and that liberation quality, but also the unstable element of Uranus. So it's like hitting a wall, something's triggered that's very personal to us within that. And then there's this need to which could be a very combustible situation, but also very freeing and liberating a one as well. It
Yeah.
just depends on where we take it. And that's the important part.
Well, with Uranus is at the apex of the T square, basically. It's said that that oftentimes is a focal point,
Yeah.
and so maybe it could be that with this, I see the Mars being like the rebellion, like the wanting to strike out or something, and Saturn being either the status quo or the authority sort of energy, and then the Uranian like it's like shifting things up, changing the game, like flipping the script or something like, or even just sort of that surprise element. And Uranus can break things. It can be a breakthrough. It can be a break apart kind of thing. I would think in some instances maybe it's like one of the things I saw coming up recently too. With this full moon was the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the 1619 Project. Um, she is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, Nicole Hannah Jones. And she actually was, it was during the eclipse period where, or it might have been before, it might have been closer to the like Sag lunar eclipses, that when she was found out that um, the university wanted to give her tenure. Everyone had voted on it. She was going to have a tenured position at the university, but then it turned out that the board of trustees voted against it. Like most likely for political reasons, because from her project came the whole race. What do you call the teachings? What are they calling it? Let me see. These race teachings. Oh God, I'm like drawing a blank here. But like racial, critical race theory,
Mm.
basically. So, which is a really hot issue in a lot of schools now. People, saying like, basically, from my understanding, is it helps us to understand, have a different perspective of slavery, and how it's not like people were just born as slaves; they were enslaved human
Enslaved.
beings,
Yeah.
right? And which sounds about right. We need to actually know the truth, and this has become a really hot button. So, in any case, um, Nicole Hannah Jones, she had been. It was a big deal because her school had, for political reasons, sort of derailed her tenure. And so I remember just recently, right at the full moon, just as Britney Spears was lifting the lid on her conservatorship, Nicole Hannah Jones said that she refused to teach at UNC, basically in a lesser, with a lesser offering, because they wanted her to still continue to teach, but they weren't going to give her tenure. And she said, like, I deserve to have tenure. Tenure, it protects the teacher, it gives them security, job security, and everything. And she's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. I mean, like any school should be really honored to have her on faculty. And the fact that she came out and spoke out against it, and she said, no, like, you aren't the ultimate authority. I am not going to teach unless you have the respect for me as, a celebrated journalist and things like that. So to me, that was very much, I saw the Mars and Leo coming out there too, and against sort of that the Saturnian element of, we're in control, we set the rules. Like, no, you're going to have to walk this, sort of tightrope um, that we impose. And she's like, no, I'm not going to do that, and I don't have to do that, And so there may be more to that story as well.
Yeah, yeah. She's like, I can make decisions for myself. I don't have to, like, just because you impose upon these rules doesn't mean I can't choose to go elsewhere. And because I know what I'm worth. That's a very thing about Uranus and Taurus too, is just being really awakened to your own worth. And the value of a situation that you might be in, and whether or not it is worth staying in this fixed, like, do we commit with the Saturn, or do we realize, hey, I'm not being valued, or my worth isn't honored here. And actually it's better if I reposition myself and go. And this can be a very personal situation that we go through, because when we think about Leo energy and Aquarius and this Mars and this Saturn, is, these are fire and air signs that are outward reaching signs. These are signs that are going to manifest in a very outward, visible way, versus the Taurus energy that Uranus is in is a receptive sign. And so this can be a very much an internal Uranian energy that is happening, that, you might not have the breakdown on the outside, you have it on the inside, but it's just as important, because whatever breaks down on the inside allows you to then carry that, the Leo agenda forward, or even the Aquarius Saturn agenda forward. And so I think that's an interesting component to all this as well.
Yeah. And I've noticed with Uranus, sometimes, especially if you're having a Uranus transit, it may start as like a dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just no longer happy. I'm just no longer excited about what I'm doing, or I just no longer fit. Something just is not right. So that inner, even if on the outside you're going through the motions, you're trying to, like, just not rock the boat, but what's being rocked is on the inside, and then that can then just change your outer circumstances when it's something that starts from the inside. So which I imagine, I can see all of this, when we're talking about the alignment of the Uranian dissatisfaction up against the Saturn status quo. No, this is how it's always been, this is how it's going to continue to be. And sticking to our guns, with, because, like, I'm the authority and this is what I say. And the Mars element of wanting change, and maybe striking out, and, like, taking a strike for that change. And so, and sometimes it is like, sometimes, Saturn is wise in some ways. It does help us to become our own authority. And sometimes that does mean getting a no and having to go back to the drawing board or something like that. But in these days, when everyone is having to revision, how we engage in society, how we engage with our power, with our authority, with, the responsibility that we take for ourselves and our lives, I don't know that anybody fully has the answer, right? I mean, we're in this one big experiment.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, well, I always I keep telling myself through these transits, I'm like, you just have to live through it. Like, you just have to continue on, live through it, and get through things. Cause you know what? Mars and Saturn meeting, chances are you got to get through something you have to get through. And maybe you do, maybe Mars hits Saturn and you're like, I'm not crazy about this situation anymore. I feel like things are going, but I'm still in it because I can't do anything right now. And so I'm going to endure. But all the while, Uranus is like, starting to shake the washing machine inside, like, okay, well, you can endure, but like, what's your plan, what's your escape strategy, or and then you can start working with that Saturn that can play out later, and maybe even later this year or the beginning of next year, when more of these, the last shift of this is going to take place. So it's almost like there's this internalized preparatory moment that is taking place in order to maybe make big changes down the road, but it's not going to happen right now. It's just going to create the pressure in order to do that. And I love how you added the focal point of Uranus, because what it made me think of too is the release point on the other side of the T square, which is the Scorpio territory. So it makes me wonder, if you start looking at your Scorpio house or your Scorpio energy, like, is there something there that I can like mitigate this with, or you know what I'm saying?
Oh my God, yes. As someone with a stellium in Scorpio, oh boy, I just want to hide in the Scorpio area while like everything else just changes around me. And I think there's a sense that there's no going back, because I like what you said about
Yeah.
like right now we're in the pressure cooker, and there's some things that just will, inextricably change. Like there'll be no going back to the old way. Either that means somebody quits, somebody leaves, or some real policy change may take effect. However, that shows up in any given situation. As you said, December 23rd is the third and final square where, let's see, Uranus will be retrograde at that time, right? And
But
Saturn
most
will be direct.
importantly, because we have to remember, with Saturn's in his own sign, right? So he's very
Mhm.
strong and pure there, but Uranus always has to look to Venus. And so whatever Venus is doing, and that's why Venus making her moves in this thing is very important. But in that last pass that you're talking about on the 23rd, Venus is station retrograde on Pluto at that time. So there is
Capricorn.
in Capricorn. And so there is and
Hmm.
Jupiter moves into Pisces again then.
I was going to
Um,
say, because I know Jupiter moves into Pisces on the 28th or the 29th. And so just a little after, so it's around that same time,
yeah.
which should be interesting. But let's not give too much away, right?
But
We've
just
got something
saying,
else to talk about.
yeah, just saying, if you're wondering what's going on now, and like in your maybe Capricornian or Virgoian energy, like like we are, and you want to mark a calendar date, the end of December is bound to be telling. Let's just say that.
Wow. Yeah. And because, you know, just essentially Uranus and Taurus has really shaken up all kinds of things with what Taurus represents. It's our shelter, it's our home, it's it's our survival, it's our money, all of these things that have come up to, have ever since Jupiter entered Taurus. I'm sorry, Uranus entered Taurus in 2018. It has made an earthquake throughout Taurus. And I have often said that anyone with any planets in Taurus, Uranus doesn't even have to be close by. It's sent like an earthquake throughout Taurus. But I've seen so many people with Taurus who normally, where Taurus is, that can be where we cling to how things are, maybe clinging to survival or even complacency. And Uranus is saying, no more of that complacency. We got to get with the program and get with it fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, you're just going to feel very disrupted all the time. And so I feel like, yeah, it's almost like the energy there is like, you actually need to change to refine what your peace is, because peace is not what it used to be. Peace is now in a different place. And so you
Yeah.
got to, figure out what that is.
That is so true. Well, one of the things we saw with Uranus and Taurus that I think was a signature of that is, like those of you who follow this podcast, I spoke about how the yoga studio I used to go to in Tallahassee, Florida, there was a shooter there who like just, who shot like 5 people, and a couple of people died. And, I mean, you go to a yoga studio, and I mean, to me, that was my healing. That was like my therapy. And then since lockdown for a year, I wasn't able to go to yoga at all. I've just started going again now, just enjoying it while I can. But I know that there's going to be back to, maybe that might be too dangerous with, if this, variant spreads. And then there was also a lot of shootings in things like churches and synagogues and mosques and things like that, that seemed to have that Uranus and Taurus element to it. So it's like where we felt safe,
Yeah.
maybe we couldn't go to these outer places for it. And so we would have to find our own sanctuary within or in simple things.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause that's where Taurus really, thrives is, it needs peace. It needs stillness. It does enjoy the simple things of life. Taurus is the one that is going to stop to smell the roses, and having to find that Taurus spot that gives us that. Well, like you're saying, the earth is shaking around us, and it's like it's hard to find stillness when there's constant maybe anxiety and what was actually very, like you said, healing and rewarding. Like yoga studio, that is the place where you want to unwind and let go. But now, even though it could be absolutely safe, even if you do have to wear your mask, there's still that maybe underlying trauma that is in the back of your head, and it goes back to the mental health that we were talking about much earlier, and why that might be that component in it where that piece isn't there because of something we've experienced something, and then there's no going back from that. And so how do we make peace with it on the inside, like you're saying? I think that's absolutely the key.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. As usual, I love chatting everything cosmic with you. Tell us what's going on with you, where people can find you. Do you have anything interesting coming up? What do you got going on?
What am I doing? Well, I'm just kind of riding out the summer right now. I actually have my birthday in the middle of all these crazy transits we're talking about. So I'm
Yay,
kind of
happy
like
birthday.
laying,
Happy solar
thank
return. Did
you.
you have a good solar return chart? I hope so.
Well, it's an electric one. It's on my solar return chart is the day that Venus squares Uranus, and I have a Venus time lord. So that should be interesting.
Woo-hoo.
But you know what? This girl is ready to go wild, so why not? Like, I'll give it a go. But you can find me over at energeticprinciples.com, and you can find me on Instagram at energetic principles. And I do a podcast, which is Energetic Principles Podcast. And right now I'm doing kind of minimal episodes, but I do season forecasts, where you can actually hear Raquel Reyes and I talk all about Cancer season on the last episode that I did. And we do touch on this Mars Uranus action, and also Mars or Venus, how she plays in, and then the Venus Mars conjunction as well, in the rest of the season. So you can.
That is brilliant. So instead of doing them every week, you're doing them for when the sun changes signs.
Yes. Yeah. So get it all in one place for a 30-day period and know what's coming. But you can find that on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Spotify. And of course I do consultations and things of the like, and do tarot as well. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to hit me up.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. And those of you who are fans of the Radiant Astrology Podcast, stay tuned, because if you've checked my iTunes, you've noticed that for some reason I only have 10 episodes, and I have a good at least 50 episodes I've done over the past few years. But I had some technical glitches. I changed my host and everything like that, which you're not ever supposed to do. I didn't find that out until afterward. So I'm going to be trying to repopulate some, because I have some really, really amazing, great older episodes that just aren't available yet. But I promise you they'll be coming back up soon. But for the meantime, make sure you're signed up to my newsletter list at radiantastrology.com in order to hear about all of my upcoming courses and events and webinars. And I have some great stuff lining up for the fall. So make sure you get on that list today. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you at the next Radiant Astrology event and on the podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.